For the past 80 years, many have referred to this period as the Long Peace. Since the end of World War II, there have been no major conflicts between major industrial powers. This is highly unusual. The broader story of human history is essentially a story of war. Most nations throughout time have lived in a near-constant condition of fighting wars or preparing for the next one. Moments of widespread peace, whether the Pax Romana or the long calm of the 19th century, have been rare intervals, usually created when one dominant military power became so strong that challenging it seemed pointless. For several reasons mentioned in an earlier video, today's international environment is filled with rising tension. The likelihood of one of several potential conflicts erupting in the near future is increasing. This video explores the regions most likely to become flashpoints for war over the next 15 to 20 years. I'm not suggesting that all these conflicts will actually occur, and some may not happen during the 2020s or 2030s. In a few cases, the timeline may stretch awkwardly into the mid-century, but this is the best we can do when discussing future predictions. Here, the goal is simply to give a broad overview of the most probable conflict zones. The details, how these wars might unfold and who might prevail, will be addressed in a later video about a potential World War III. With that clarified, let's begin. The world today is incredibly dynamic and constantly shifting. It can be difficult to stay updated on all the major developments because everything seems to be changing at once. Should we be paying more attention to China, the Middle East, US elections, or Africa? This is where Magellan TV becomes useful. Created by documentary filmmakers, Magellan TV is a streaming platform that offers a wide range of content, including a strong collection on geopolitics. One documentary I particularly enjoyed is Danger Zone, in which British journalist Arjulit Bunya travels through 6 active conflict areas to understand what daily life looks like there. The film highlights life inside war zones, including conflicts most people know little about, such as insurgencies in Thailand and the Philippines. It's a sobering reminder that thousands of people are dying today in wars many of us have never even heard of. Beyond geopolitical content, Magellan features some of the best history documentaries available, covering everything from the ancient world to modern times, along with biographies and extensive Second World War materials. It works on almost any device and streams in 4K at no extra cost. Click the link in the description to explore whatever interests you. This next issue concerns me the most. As the global population grows, and as expectations for a higher standard of living continue to rise, competition for resources becomes nearly unavoidable. This challenge is intensified by climate change, which, to put it simply, climate change is making the Arctic wetter and the tropics drier, which increases water shortages in some of the world's most populated regions. Among all the issues discussed here, conflicts over water are often the hardest to resolve and the most likely to occur. This is because water is usually an existential concern for the countries involved, something they are willing to fight and even die for. When upstream nations build dams on major rivers, the risk of conflict rises sharply. In many cases, war becomes probable unless an unexpected factor intervenes. For downstream countries, this is a matter of survival. They rely on these rivers as their primary, or sometimes only, source of water. If a downstream nation loses access to its water supply, it may lose its independence at best, or in the worst-case scenario, cease to exist. A major example of this type of conflict is the water dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt. Ethiopia is constructing the Grand Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, which affects Egypt's water flow. To give an idea of the scale, Egypt depends on the Nile for roughly 95% of its water. A projected 10% reduction in the river's flow could reduce Egyptian farmland outside the delta by about 30%, and farmland within the delta by around 25%. Hydropower output might fall by up to 30%. Some studies even estimate that nearly half of Egypt's agricultural land could be lost, a scenario considered plausible by many analysts. This is alarming for a country where a large share of the population relies on subsistence farming. From Ethiopia's perspective, the dam offers enormous economic benefits. It could generate enough affordable electricity to power all of Ethiopia and even a large portion of Sudan. In fact, supplying electricity to Sudan, the next downstream nation, is one of the reasons Sudan has sided with Ethiopia instead of Egypt. Sudan is also less dependent on the Nile due to higher rainfall and accessible aquifers. This situation also includes elements of a proxy conflict. Iran and Turkey generally support Ethiopia, while Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf Arab states back Egypt. However, in the event of a direct confrontation, it's unlikely that any of these countries would intervene militarily. At the end of August, Egypt and Ethiopia failed to reach an agreement, meaning Ethiopia plans to move forward with dam operations without Egyptian approval. As a response, the United States suspended aid to Ethiopia, though Ethiopia already leans more toward China. Neither Ethiopia nor Egypt is a major global power, so both are influenced by the interests of larger nations. China could theoretically pressure Ethiopia to halt construction, but it currently has no incentive to do so. Ethiopia is also dealing with internal instability, including a high risk of civil conflict involving the Tigray ethnic group, which could delay or disrupt the entire project. Meanwhile, Egypt, whose military historically ranks poorly and lacks the ability to project force across Sudan and into Ethiopia, would likely lose a war over the dam. Ethiopia's mountainous landscape further strengthens its defensive position. Ethiopia is a mountainous country known for its difficult terrain and a population recognized for being resilient fighters. If the Nile were significantly restricted, it could trigger one of the worst humanitarian crises in history. Egypt has a population of around 100 million people, and even if only 2%, a very conservative estimate, were displaced, it would already rank among the largest refugee crises ever recorded. If the more realistic estimate of roughly 30 million people were forced to leave, the impact would be so large that it could transform European civilization entirely. Europe would either have to adopt strict anti-immigration policies and shift its core political ideology or face major internal breakdown. The second major region where water politics pose serious risks is the Tigris-Euphrates river system, which flows through Iraq from its sources in Turkey. Turkey is currently building dams on both rivers, and like Egypt, Iraq is almost fully dependent on this water. I've mentioned in past live streams that Turkey is likely to become a major power in the future. It is expanding its influence in multiple directions, and Iraq is likely part of this broader strategy. Controlling these rivers would give Turkey leverage over the entire region, which is historically unsurprising. Large multi-ethnic empires have ruled this area for centuries, and the Turks controlled Iraq for most of the last 1,000 years. This situation resembles the larger pattern seen in irrigation-based civilizations. These societies typically functioned as highly centralized aristocracies, where the ruling elite held power by managing water systems. Whoever controlled irrigation controlled the entire population, since withholding water could suppress any dissent. The difference today is that instead of ancient Sumerian or Akkadian rulers, modern Turkey holds the advantage. Moving eastward, another region at risk of water conflict is Central Asia. Tajikistan is constructing dams that affect Uzbekistan, a neighboring desert country heavily reliant on this water. Central Asia is especially complex, shaped by competing influences from Russia, China, Islamist groups, and authoritarian local governments. But the dominant factor is the rapid population growth since 1990, which has doubled in some areas and placed extreme pressure on the environment. The shrinking of the Aral Sea has worsened desertification, and economic stagnation combined with harsh political systems makes the situation even more volatile. Of all the regions discussed, Central Asia concerns me the most. Multiple destabilizing factors are converging there, and it feels likely that something serious will happen, though it's unclear exactly what. Some analysts suggest a scenario in which Uzbekistan, frustrated with water shortages, might use military force against the much smaller Tajikistan to secure its water supply. This could allow Uzbekistan to emerge as a dominant regional power centered around a broader Uzbek identity. This outcome is possible, as Uzbekistan has significant military, demographic, and logistical advantages over its neighbors. However, it's still uncertain whether those advantages would be enough to guarantee success. One complication is Uzbekistan's geographic position in the center of the region. If Uzbekistan attempted to rise as a major power, it would likely draw strong reactions from China, Russia, and possibly a future, more assertive Iran, all of whom could shut down such ambitions quickly. This introduces another possible outcome. the entire region could be absorbed or dominated by one of these larger powers. A similarly plausible scenario is a complete regional collapse, resembling the Middle East before 2011, especially since many of the underlying conditions in both regions are strikingly alike. The fourth, and in my view, the most alarming and potentially deadly water conflict involves India and China. China is constructing around 300 dams along its border with India in the Himalayan region, restricting the flow of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. China has shown no willingness to compromise on this issue, while nearly 1 billion people depend on these rivers. This makes the situation deeply concerning. Part of China's motivation stems from its own vulnerabilities. Large parts of northern China are expected to face severe water shortages by 2030. Although the North China Plain is relatively well-watered, the demands from China's industrial sector and heavy water pollution create enormous pressure. If China could secure control over India's water supply, rather than simply cutting it, it could use this as powerful leverage, potentially pressuring India into a subordinate political position. China has also executed a highly effective geopolitical strategy in South Asia. Pakistan, Nepal, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and even Iran now align with China to varying degrees. India remains the only significant regional power resisting Chinese influence. If India were to fall into China's sphere, Beijing would effectively control most of the Asian continent. India is also a strategic partner of the United States. If India and China entered a conflict over water, the US would almost certainly support India, knowing that India alone would struggle militarily against China. Washington would intervene primarily to prevent Chinese dominance in Asia. As a result, an India-China water war could quickly escalate into a global conflict. Such a war would be catastrophic. Both nations possess nuclear weapons, and together their populations exceed the total number of people on Earth during World War II. Casualties could surpass those of any conflict in recorded history. Looking ahead, the decades of communist rule in Russia and China will likely be viewed as major historical turning points. These systems created long-lasting structural problems that remain unresolved and may function as time bombs if not addressed. One of the most significant of these issues is demographics. Communist governments often kept their populations economically poor while simultaneously reducing birth rates. This trend can be seen across nearly every region under long-term communist control. For instance, under Stalin's Soviet Union, Russia's average births per woman, Russia's fertility rate fell from about 6.5 children per woman to 2.8, and then dropped below replacement level in the 1970s. China faced a similar trend, with its one-child policy creating a severe demographic imbalance. Across the world, higher urbanization strongly correlates with lower birth rates. As societies become more urban, people generally have fewer children. Wealthier countries usually end up with older populations but can support them more effectively due to stronger economies. Communist governments made a strategic mistake by pushing people from rural areas into cities before their economies were developed enough to sustain such transitions. This resulted in societies that became both poor and old at the same time. For comparison, the average American from a wealthy nation is younger than the average person in Russia or China, even though those countries are significantly poorer. Politically, aging populations present complex challenges. Elderly citizens require more support while contributing less economically, whereas younger people tend to drive productivity. However, when youth populations grow too large, they can trigger political instability. Europe's weakened geopolitical influence and the Middle East's prolonged civil conflicts are both connected to demographic pressures. Russian and Chinese leaders understand that they have a limited window before their populations become so old that maintaining strong military forces becomes difficult. China faces this problem even more intensely. Its economic model depends on exporting cheap labor, yet it is nearing the middle-income trap, a stage where it is too wealthy to rely on low-wage labor, but not wealthy enough to shift fully to domestic consumption. Combining this with rapid aging creates a particularly dangerous economic situation. Russia, on the other hand, is geographically exposed. Its flat terrain lacks natural defensive barriers, forcing it to rely on sheer population size as a strategic advantage. Historically, Russia compensated for its weak defenses by using large numbers of soldiers. But as its population shrinks and ages, this strategy becomes unsustainable. This urgency explains why both Russia and China are acting more assertively. They recognize they have limited time to secure their positions in the global order before demographic decline weakens them. Because of this, Russia may behave unpredictably in the coming years. The current crisis in Belarus provides Moscow with a convenient opportunity. The weakened position of President Lukashenko creates an opening for Putin to intervene, restore control, and potentially finalize the long-discussed union state between Russia and Belarus. While I do not expect Russia to initiate a direct war with Europe, the greatest risk would come from an overly aggressive Russian move leading to miscommunication and accidental escalation, driven largely by Russia's growing desperation. China's Belt and Road Initiative is partly designed to build a younger consumer base across Asia. As China's own population ages, it aims to sell goods to developing regions with younger demographics. Populations across Asia and Africa continue to grow rapidly, or at least that is the expectation. China, however, faces a different challenge. It is heavily dependent on imported food, natural resources, and oil that arrive by sea. Nearly all of these supplies pass through the Strait of Malacca. Because the United States is the world's dominant naval power, it holds a major strategic advantage over China. One of the main reasons China is investing so heavily in the Belt and Road Initiative is to establish a land-based network that allows the transport of essential goods, such as food and energy, across Central Asia instead of through vulnerable sea routes. The core issue is that if China succeeds in connecting Asia by land, it could effectively link together a majority of the world's population. This would severely weaken the American-European naval system that currently moves most of the world's trade. Historically, this idea is not new. For most of human history, the center of global power was not the oceans but the Eurasian landmass. A shift back to that structure would not be unusual. China's ability to rise or even maintain its status as a major power largely depends on whether it can build this Eurasian trade network before its rapidly aging population slows the country down. China's leadership understands this well, and that awareness creates significant geopolitical tension. Africa, in contrast, faces the opposite demographic problem. The continent has experienced massive population growth, resulting in a very young population living within borders that often do not reflect ethnic or historical realities. Many nations are run by entrenched elites, and economic development has not kept pace with demographic expansion. If this sounds familiar, it resembles the conditions that fueled a decade of conflict in the Middle East, but Africa's challenges are even more severe. For example, projections suggest that Lagos, Nigeria, could reach a population of 30 million by 2050, despite having weak infrastructure, limited export capacity, and fragile supply chains. Such rapid growth would likely result in enormous urban slums, creating ideal conditions for disease outbreaks and political extremism. When these pressures occur across an entire continent, combined with declining water resources due to climate change and insufficient economic systems to support the numbers, the situation becomes extremely unstable. A major crisis seems inevitable. The only uncertainty is whether it will peak in the 2020s or the 2030s. There is a concept known as the Thucydides trap, which suggests that an established power often attempts to suppress a rising power before it becomes strong enough to challenge the status quo. The classic example is the Peloponnesian War. Athens was growing rapidly, and Sparta believed conflict was unavoidable unless it acted first. In Graham Allison's book on the subject, he outlines 15 such cases from the past 500 years of European history, 12 of which resulted in war. This framework is frequently used to describe the current relationship between the United States and China. China continues to grow in influence, while the U.S., by comparison, appears to be slowing down. This suggests that it is within America's strategic interest to limit China's rise before it becomes powerful enough to challenge the United States. There is some truth to this, but another way to view the situation is through the lens of demographic trends discussed earlier. China is heading toward a severe aging crisis, while the U.S. maintains relatively stable population growth. The challenge, one we have seen repeatedly throughout history, is that nations often misunderstand or underestimate each other's vulnerabilities. A classic example comes from the years leading up to World War I. Britain and France feared that Germany would surpass them if they failed to act. At the same time, Germany believed Russia would outgrow and overpower it unless Germany took preemptive measures. Meanwhile, both Russia and Austria-Hungary worried that modernization and rising ethnic nationalism would eventually fracture their empires. These overlapping insecurities created an environment of escalating tension and reckless decision-making, ultimately leading to the First World War. The conflict did not erupt because of randomness or irrational behavior. Instead, it emerged from a series of small actions that each nation saw as necessary for its own survival. Yet collectively, these decisions led to disaster. A similar dynamic is unfolding today. Countries like Japan, India, the United States, and Vietnam fear that failing to respond could allow China to dominate them. On the other side, China and Russia face demographic insecurity, as mentioned earlier. Under similar pressures, Turkey recognizes that it sits in a region filled with rapidly aging societies and weakening economies. With its relatively young and growing population, it sees an opportunity to expand its influence. North Korea represents an extreme version of this phenomenon. Its leadership understands that the regime is outdated and surviving on borrowed time. As a result, it aggressively pursues nuclear weapons to pressure other nations into concessions that could prolong its rule. Because North Korea remains closely connected to China, any U.S. military invasion would place American troops near the Chinese border, an outcome Beijing would not tolerate. History already showed the consequences of such a situation during the Korean War in the 1950s. Despite its fragility, North Korea poses significant geopolitical risks because of the desperate nature of its leadership. A different kind of urgency emerged with the rapid spread of COVID-19. As explained in the previous video, many people around the world were already struggling due to rising living costs. The pandemic and its economic fallout intensified this hardship, producing large populations facing extreme pressure. Historically, such stressed societies tend to move in one of two directions: internal conflict or external confrontation. Governments often shift attention toward outside rivals to rally national unity or attempt to use conflict as a means to reshape the international system in their favor. Their goal is to make their populations wealthier and their nation stronger, and the motivation to do so increases as internal pressures rise. China represents the clearest example of this dynamic. The Chinese Communist Party has remained in power, while other communist governments collapsed, because it made an unspoken agreement with the Chinese public. In return for rising incomes and improved living standards, people would tolerate political repression and corruption. However, the economic slowdown caused by the trade war and COVID-19 has undermined the foundation of this deal. For instance, China backed away from its Made in China 2025 plan, which relied heavily on acquiring Western technology and using it to transform China into a high-tech manufacturing hub. After the West took stronger action against intellectual property theft, the initiative became unrealistic. This shift is likely part of the reason China is now tightening political control, increasing repression, and trying to stir ideological loyalty, an attempt to maintain stability after no longer fulfilling its side of the bargain. It may sound ironic coming from an American, but the period of U.S. global dominance has been one of the most prosperous eras in human history. This is not meant to sound nationalistic. It is simply reflected in nearly every measurable category: nutrition, health, literacy, personal freedom, peace, wealth, and national sovereignty. Much of this is because the United States committed to defending many countries from external threats, which encouraged cooperation instead of conquest. At the same time, the U.S. Navy secured the world's sea routes, enabling inexpensive and safe maritime trade across the globe. America benefited from this system, especially through access to cheap credit, but those gains mostly went to the upper classes. Meanwhile, the American middle class suffered from competition with lower-cost foreign labor. U.S. industries and communities were weakened by a global trade system that allowed most countries to access the American market freely, even as they maintained tariffs against the United States. Since most Americans did not benefit from this arrangement, a political backlash has grown inside the country. As a result, the U.S. is reconsidering its global role. What many outside observers fail to understand is that America does not actually depend much on the rest of the world. The U.S. has a level of economic independence similar to nations like Sudan, Ethiopia, or Cuba. It is a net exporter of oil, food, industrial goods, and nearly every essential resource. Over the next 20 to 30 years, we are likely to see the United States gradually withdraw its power from regions such as the Middle East, whose oil America no longer requires, and reduce its involvement in most of the world, except for key developed regions. Only regions wealthy enough to justify continued American involvement are likely to remain under U.S. influence. The United States will no longer safeguard global maritime trade to the extent it once did. It will probably maintain a presence in places like Europe and East Asia, but it has grown tired of spending money to station troops across distant continents. This shift may lead the U.S. to demand some form of compensation from these regions in exchange for protection, or it may push countries to strengthen their own militaries. As these nations build up their forces, America's influence over them will weaken. Once countries like France and Germany develop stronger military capabilities, their willingness to follow U.S. direction will naturally decline. Another point to consider is that, in a conflict with Russia or China, the U.S. would need to heavily arm Japan, Germany, and Turkey to stand a real chance. Strengthening and militarizing these nations would dramatically reshape global geopolitics. If America withdraws from global security responsibilities, a massive power vacuum will emerge. Many African nations, for example, have very weak militaries, and the only reason they have not been recolonized, fragmented, or overtaken is because the American-led international system has prevented it. When that protection disappears, countries that lack strong institutions or clear reasons for their borders, often drawn by European diplomats, may struggle to remain intact. Turkey and Iran, as industrialized, populous, and militarily capable regional powers, are positioned to benefit significantly. They could expand their influence and potentially build large spheres of control once the U.S. steps back. Similarly, without American protection of Europe's access to foreign energy, European nations, especially France, Western Europe's most active military power, might extend influence into Africa. France already has a strong presence in West Africa and could expand further to secure oil and other resources the U.S. will no longer manage. Well, that brings us to the end of a rather heavy discussion. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more content. You can also support me on Patreon, where I share detailed maps and the first chapter of my world history project. Follow me on Twitter as well. As always, thank you for watching, and have a great day.